The 1999 remake, on the other hand, is a dreamlike, eccentric roller coaster that, to be honest, is nowhere near as bad as its scathing reputation will have you believe, albeit if you go in with the right. I'm not here to say it's necessarily a good film or some hidden gem or whatever, but what I am saying is that it's an endearing piece of peak 90s supernatural schlock that, for all its unending faults, is still somehow wonderfully well executed from a production design and editing standpoint. After all, The Haunting remake was originally meant to be a Steven Spielberg production in collaboration with Stephen King. So Spielberg's editor Michael Kahn was left to piece together whatever monstrosity the director of Twister, Speed, and its dreadful sequel could come up with. So, The Haunting remake takes quite the unsubtle approach to going against the ethos of Jackson's novel and blatantly admitting that yes, our house is haunted, ghosts are real, it's the new millennium, here they are to mess your shit up. It's probably best to forget anything to do with Hill House for this one, because the remake is almost entirely its own thing, as questionable as that may be. It pretty much chops and changes things in the same way, so with that said, it's surprisingly faithful to the general setup, by giving appropriate emphasis to Eleanor's mental condition, if indeed it sacrifices the unique ambiguity in favour of whatever the hell nightmare this is. I know how this sounds, but this is what I mean by kinda liking the film if you set the right expectations, because I think the film sits in this unusual threshold between young adult and kids movie, and I'm convinced it's entirely intentional. The best word I can use to describe The Haunting remake is that it's quirky. I mean, up against the Haunted Hill and 13 Ghosts remake, while this one feels more like a whimsical Sunday afternoon ghost adventure. In fact, if we're being pedantic about genre, I'm more inclined to call it a supernatural fantasy than a horror movie, because on one extreme you have mature, sometimes somber adult interactions, but then it turns into a DreamWorks animated production because, well, it is a DreamWorks film after all. I've heard folks say phrases like The Haunting suffers from laughably bad CGI, but to be honest, I don't think it's necessarily bad, it's just stylistically misplaced with the tone of the human drama. It's more so an issue of bad direction, because credit where credit is due, there's plenty of exaggerated inventiveness that you'd rightfully expect to see from an animated production. As it stands, calling it bad seems incorrect because CGI takes a tremendous amount of hard work, it just doesn't blend naturally with the moody, all too serious performances. However, arguably because it feels out of place, it unintentionally enters into its own uncanny realm of surrealism that's hard to take your eyes away from. It's not scary in any way, but it's certainly off-putting to some extent. I just find there's something weird about the slimy, organic feel of the CGI that I can't totally explain. If you think halfway between them for every scare, you've more or less got an idea for what The Haunting's idea of horror is. Whereas The Haunting's animation team just decided to have fun with making Crane an embodiment of the house. Yeah, again, it's not scary, at least for me personally, but it undeniably has a memorable charm to it. When we continue to put aside the film's complete disregard for the novel, the remake's version of Hill House is a powerfully spectacular and entrancingly elaborate explosion of design is my aesthetic. There's a strong argument to say it's overindulgent, but when you consider it against the CGI, it feels appropriate in its own romantic way. Weird comparison, but it reminded me of the Spencer Mansion from Resident Evil. It's initially just a normal mansion, but the deeper you explore, the more it becomes this labyrinth of contrived rooms that slowly break away from reality. With Hill House, there's two ways to look at it. It feels imposing, inescapable, and optical, like an M.C. Escher painting, as if it's always watching and controlling you, which eventually becomes quite literal with Crane's spirit manifesting within the house, but on the other hand, it seems to reflect how Eleanor's love for the house mirrors a sort of childhood wonder, as she ironically feels free from the constraints her family has over her. This point in particular is an important detail because it's vividly established in the beginning that Eleanor never had a chance to live an independent adult life because she felt responsible for caring for her sick mother. Thus, she exhibits a fragile innocence I'm sure most of us can poignantly relate to when we hold onto the past. When her mother dies, Eleanor doesn't actually end up inheriting her family home, as it instead goes to her older sister, who, along with her husband, snobbishly pressures Eleanor to come live with them as their servant, more or less, showing little compassion for how emotionally significant Eleanor's childhood home was to her. As such, seeing Eleanor exude so much joy and excitement is rather gratifying when her mind is plagued with nothing but negative, haunting thoughts, which are much more noticeable in the original 1963 version. In fact, Eleanor's initial introduction to Theo is probably one of the best scenes because not only is their chemistry super engaging, but the stark contrast between their personalities is fascinating in its own right. Theo is basically an alternative version of Eleanor, even going as far as to call attention to her timid, lost, and seemingly confused identity, one that Eleanor never truly had time to define.
Blank canvas. I could paint your portrait directly on you.
By the way, side note, I'm well aware Liam Neeson is in this, but he looks so disinterested in being there that his performance does nothing but service the character he plays. The only stray observation I have is that he seems to only half-heartedly commit to an American accent before just lapsing back into his natural Northern Irish accent, although at least he figured out how to say however correctly.
However.
Anyway, Owen Wilson typically gets a lot of criticism thrown his way for his acting abilities, but I think it's important to understand where he's likely coming from because he does feel very out of place in this film. He can be sociably relatable when he goes all in on the quirks of his character. However, I feel Owen Wilson's attempts at an obvious deadpan delivery simply lacks the creative nuance to make it comedically evident. Let me explain. Wilson's character Luke is essentially the sardonic comic relief, as Wilson kinda just shows up without much time to interact with characters in any truly meaningful way. The problem with Wilson's version, and it's not really his fault, is that while he is sympathetic with his natural awkwardness, his personality falls flat due to a lack of any scenes that demonstrate his sincerity, thus explaining why I feel the tone of his delivery is confused and conflicting. Sometimes I felt a joke or comment that should come off as cheeky or lighthearted instead ends up feeling more unintentionally hostile than anything else. Or maybe it's just my inability to read his character because I know people like him that have that sort of misplaced arrogance and it makes me uncomfortable to want to interact with them.
Yeah, Nell, I think what Dr. Merrow is trying to say is that you're a basket case, just like the rest of us.
So, considering the remake shamelessly commits to the ghosts being real, it adds its own original lore to establish a somewhat cartoonish villain for the audience. In the remake, cliche is the aim of the game, as Crane is revealed to be an evil tyrant who used orphans for abusive child labour before murdering them and destroying their remains in a fireplace. Yeah, I'm just as baffled as to how they got to that harrowing revision. As such, Eleanor is not only haunted by Crane, but also the children, who seek someone pure and innocent to help them escape purgatory, which is literally pointed out to us via a big spooky door that Eleanor talks about earlier in the film. Now, again, I will stress that the maturity of the novel it frankly has little to no connection to at this point is sacrificed for something ridiculously far-fetched, but I do like the concept behind it in theory. Sure, omitting the mental illness angle makes it vapid and unintelligent, but like I've said before with schlocky old-school ghost stories, I can't help but get a little nostalgic with it. It's just a personal weakness of mine, let's say. It utterly throws away its one unique quality, but since I had muted expectations going in, I quite liked the sacrificial ending of having Eleanor become a spiritual mother to these forgotten children, as silly as it sounds. In a way, it's bittersweet in how Eleanor seems to find happiness, but ultimately retains her role as a carer who must put her own desires aside for the sake of those who need help. Nick is everything you've seen before, but heated in a microwave, yet it strangely has a fatally flawed charm that somehow left me nodding, saying to myself, yeah, that's a guilty pleasure I'm afraid to admit.